There's a lot happening with the Vikings right now, and some of these moves are way more interesting than they might look at first. We've got roster changes, a young player admitting he still has work to do, and a situation that could become a big talking point heading into the season. So stick with me, because there's definitely a lot to unpack here. Make sure to hit the like button, since I always keep you well informed here, and write "Go Vikings" in the comments. Something is shifting inside the Minnesota Vikings roster right now. And while the four moves made this afternoon may look routine at first glance, there is more behind them than simply replacing two names with two others. Minnesota is clearly using these final days of the preseason to evaluate depth, conditioning, roster flexibility, and which players can actually handle meaningful snaps when the regular season arrives. And one of the most interesting developments may not even be the transactions themselves. It may be what one young defensive lineman admitted after Minnesota's second preseason game. The Vikings officially waived defensive lineman Taki Taimani, ending the run of a player who had become a memorable preseason figure largely because of his personality and the energy he brought around the team. Taimani simply did not show enough to force his way onto the final roster, and Minnesota reached the point where it felt comfortable moving on. The Vikings also waived cornerback Tyreek Chappelle, another move that creates space as the organization continues reducing and reshaping the roster before the regular season. But Minnesota did not leave those spots empty. The Vikings brought in defensive lineman Jonathan Harris, a name some Minnesota fans should already recognize, and they also signed tight end Matt Lauter. The Lauter addition is interesting because the battle for the third tight end spot already appears to involve Gavin Bartholomew and Ben Urasek. Based on what we have seen so far, Lauter does not necessarily arrive looking like the favorite to jump both of them and steal a place on the 53-man roster. This could simply be Minnesota adding another body for the final preseason game, especially considering how little the coaching staff may want to expose its more important players against Denver. And that matters. If the Vikings decide not to play many of their second-team players Friday night against the Broncos, we could see a game dominated by third- and fourth-string players. That would give someone like Lauter an opportunity to receive a significant amount of work immediately, even if his long-term chances of making the roster remain uncertain. Jonathan Harris, however, is a different kind of addition because Minnesota already knows him. Harris was with the Vikings during the preseason last year, and he played well enough to leave a legitimate impression. He was not simply occupying snaps. His performance stood out, particularly against the run. According to the numbers mentioned in the report, Harris finished that preseason with a 75.2 overall PFF grade. He showed good work as a run defender, graded well as a tackler, and gave Minnesota the type of dependable interior presence teams need when evaluating the bottom half of a defensive line rotation. The limitation was also clear. Harris did not offer the same kind of impact as a pass rusher, but Minnesota may not need him to. If the goal is to bring in an experienced defensive tackle who already understands the environment, can absorb snaps against Denver and potentially compete for a practice squad role, Harris makes plenty of sense. Friday night could become another opportunity for him to remind the Vikings why they liked what they saw from him before. And this is where the defensive tackle situation becomes much more interesting. With Taimani gone and Harris now back in the building, Minnesota's interior group features Caleb Banks, Jalen Redmond, and Levi Drake Rodriguez among the players expected to hold major roles. Banks is the name that deserves the most attention right now. Not because he has suddenly failed, not because the Vikings have given up on him, but because Banks himself openly admitted that one of the concerns visible on the field is real. After Minnesota's second preseason game against Baltimore, Banks said, "To be honest, I'm out of shape right now. I need to run more gassers after practice. You guys will see me doing that." That is a revealing statement from a young player carrying major expectations. Players at this level rarely enjoy publicly identifying weaknesses in their own game, particularly when they enter the league with the kind of expectations surrounding a first-round pick. Banks did exactly that. He acknowledged that his conditioning is not where it needs to be, and he did it after a game in which that problem became increasingly visible the longer he stayed on the field. And Brian Flores may have wanted him to feel exactly what an NFL workload is going to demand. Banks played the entire first half against Baltimore. Then Minnesota sent him back onto the field for the opening drive of the third quarter. That is a heavy preseason workload for someone expected to become an important part of this defense. By the third quarter, Banks appeared winded. That raises an interesting possibility. Maybe Flores was not simply evaluating him. Maybe he was creating a teaching moment. If Banks wants to become an every-down defensive lineman, if he wants to play 80 or 85% of Minnesota's defensive snaps, then this is the physical standard he will eventually have to meet. Playing dominant football for a handful of snaps is one thing. Maintaining technique, leverage, and explosiveness while fatigue starts taking over is something completely different. And conditioning is not the only issue. Pad level has also become an area to watch. Banks is an enormous defensive lineman, standing around 6'6" with a reported 7'1" wingspan. That length gives him unusual physical tools, but it can also create natural leverage problems. Taller defensive linemen have to work constantly to avoid playing too high, because NFL offensive linemen will immediately attack their chest and move them if they lose leverage. When Banks gets it right, though, the flashes are extremely difficult to ignore. His combination of size, athleticism, and movement ability has already produced moments that suggest why Minnesota invested so heavily in him. There have been snaps where he looks like the kind of interior defender capable of creating problems that cannot be solved simply by assigning one blocker. But the preseason numbers show how unfinished the process still is. Against the New York Giants, Banks posted a 30.4 overall PFF grade and a 32.0 run defense grade. Then came improvement against Baltimore. His overall grade climbed to 48.1, while his run defense grade rose to 42.8. Those are still not dominant numbers. They are not even close to where Minnesota ultimately wants him to be. But the direction matters. Banks struggled badly in the first preseason game, improved in the second, and then openly acknowledged the conditioning problem he still needs to fix. That is why Minnesota may have to be patient. There is no guarantee Banks will be ready to start immediately in Week 1. The Vikings could decide that his development requires more time before placing a major regular season workload on his shoulders. His physical ceiling is obvious, but conditioning, leverage, and consistency could determine how quickly he actually reaches it. And that creates a fascinating question for Vikings fans. Are these simply normal growing pains for a young defensive lineman with rare physical tools? Or are you genuinely concerned about Caleb Banks admitting he is not yet in the shape required for the role Minnesota eventually wants him to play? Tell me what you think in the comments, because I want to know where Vikings fans stand on this one. Are you concerned about Banks right now? Or do you see this as part of the development process? And now I want to hear from Vikings fans. Do you believe Minnesota is handling these roster decisions the right way? And how concerned are you about Caleb Banks' conditioning and development heading into the season? Drop your opinion in the comments, because I'll be reading what the fan base has to say. If you enjoyed the update and want to stay on top of everything happening with the Vikings, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. And as always, SKOL Vikings!